Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving into some really cool excerpts you sent us from Brain Behavior, an introduction to behavioral neuroscience.
Yeah, we'll be focusing on the first couple of chapters. It's amazing to think that everything we do, think, and feel stems from this complex organ.
I know, right? It's like, how can this lump of tissue be responsible for so much? Uncovering those fundamental principles of how our brains work is exactly what we're going to be doing today.
For sure.
One thing that really stood out to me was how the textbook presented the history of behavioral neuroscience.
Oh, yeah.
It's like a detective story.
I like that.
For the longest time, people thought communication within the brain was instantaneous.
Instantaneous.
Like it just happened. No time lag or anything. Then Hermann von Helmholtz came along and actually measured the speed of nerve conduction.
Whoa, so it wasn't instant.
Nope. It had a speed, a measurable speed, which totally changed the game.
That's a great point. His work proved that the brain operates on a physical, measurable scale, just like any other organ in the body.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It paved the way for modern neuroscience.
And then there's that crazy story of Phineas Gage.
Oh my gosh, yes. The railroad worker who had that iron rod go through his skull.
Yeah.
Talk about a bad day at work.
Yeah.
But his case was so important for the field.
Absolutely. Gage's case was pivotal in understanding the concept of localization of function.
You mean how different parts of the brain are responsible for specific functions?
Exactly. By observing the changes in his personality after damage to his frontal lobes, scientists realized that specific areas controlled specific things.
That's incredible.
If you think about it, that's the basis for modern brain surgery.
Whoa.
And even therapies like transcranial magnetic stimulation, where they use magnets to stimulate specific brain areas.
It really makes you think, how much of us is tied to specific parts of our brain?
It's a fascinating question.
Like, if those parts were damaged, would we still be the same person?
Right.
Big question. And speaking of what makes us us, the textbook goes into the nature versus nurture debate.
The classic question.
Are we shaped by our genes, our experiences, or a combo of both?
Of course, the textbook says it's not an either situation.
Right.
It's this amazing interplay between genes and environment that makes each individual unique.
So, genes and environment are both essential.
Exactly. Think of it this way. Genes are like a blueprint,
Okay.
providing the basic plan for who we are, but our environment and experiences are the builders.
So our environment shapes how that blueprint is actually constructed.
Go at it.
So it's not like our DNA is destiny. We have some say in who we become.
Absolutely.
That's pretty empowering.
And the textbook highlights some really cool research initiatives,
Oh yeah, like what?
like the Human Genome Project and the ENCODE Project.
I've heard of those. What do they do?
These projects have been working to map out our genes and understanding how they interact with environmental factors.
To influence our personality, our susceptibility to diseases, all of that.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the big picture, but what about the nitty-gritty of how our brains work? The textbook talks about neurons, those tiny information messengers in our nervous system.
They really are the building blocks of everything our brains do.
And there are billions of them, right?
Billions. And the textbook does a great job explaining the different parts of a neuron.
Like the dendrites, the axon, and the synapse, right?
Yes. Those are the key players. And it explains how they all work together to transmit information.
Right, like some super complex electrical and chemical relay race going on inside our heads. It also mentioned things like action potentials, local potentials, and ion channels.
I know, there's a lot of terminology.
It can seem overwhelming at first, but basically neurons talk to each other using electrical and chemical signals.
Exactly. Those ion channels are like tiny gates on the neuron's surface,
Okay.
controlling the flow of charged particles to create the electrical signals that travel down the neuron's axon.
So it's not just an on-off switch. It's this whole orchestrated flow of electrical activity.
It is. And then you have signals that excite the neuron, making it more likely to fire,
Okay.
and other signals that inhibit it, preventing it from firing.
So it's a constant push and pull.
Exactly. This interplay of excitation and inhibition is what allows our brains to process information and make decisions.
That's incredible. So we've got all these neurons constantly firing and sending signals throughout the brain. But how does the brain actually make sense of all this activity?
Good question. The textbook talks about neural codes.
Neural codes, what are those?
Neural codes are the specific patterns of neural activity that convey information.
I don't quite get it.
Think about it like Morse code.
Okay.
It's not just about the dots and dashes themselves, but the precise sequence of those dots and dashes that encodes a specific message.
So it's the pattern that matters.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
The textbook uses a study by DiLorenzo and Hecht to illustrate this point.
Okay, tell me about it.
They replicated specific patterns of activity in taste neurons in rats, and get this, the rats responded as if they were tasting different flavors, even though they were only receiving electrical stimulation.
That's wild. So they essentially tricked the brain into thinking it was tasting something even though it wasn't.
Precisely. This shows just how powerful those patterns of neural activity are in creating our sensory experiences.
Wow, so we've gone from the historical beginnings of neuroscience to the intricate world of neurons and neural codes.
It's amazing.
It's mind-blowing to think that all of this is happening inside our heads every second of every day.
It is, and we've only scratched the surface.
I bet. There's so much more to uncover about how our brains develop, adapt, and shape our behaviors.
Exactly, and we'll dive deeper into some of those areas as we continue our exploration. Remember those neurons we talked about? The ones constantly sending messages back and forth? All that communication happens at the synapse.
Oh yeah, the synapse.
That tiny gap between neurons.
The place where the real magic happens. It's amazing to me how these cells can communicate without actually touching.
Right. The textbook describes it like a microscopic handshake.
I love that visual.
So you've got the presynaptic neuron, the one sending the message,
Okay.
and then you have the postsynaptic neuron, the one on the receiving end,
Got it.
and bridging that gap. That's where neurotransmitters come in.
Those chemical messengers.
Exactly. They carry the signal across the synapse.
The textbook went into a lot of detail about neurotransmitters.
Oh, yeah.
It's like this whole complex chemical language, right? Different neurotransmitters sending different messages.
Absolutely. And just like words can have different meanings depending on the context, different neurotransmitters can have a variety of effects on the postsynaptic neuron.
So it's not just one message.
Nope. Some neurotransmitters excite the neuron, making it more likely to fire, while others inhibit it, making it less likely to fire.
It's like a constant balancing act.
Ex-
It's mind-boggling how these tiny molecules can have such a huge impact on our behavior and experiences.
It is.
The textbook mentioned how certain drugs can actually mess with this process. Like cocaine,
Uh-huh.
which blocks the reuptake of dopamine.
That's a good example. Cocaine essentially floods the synapse with dopamine.
Amplifying its effects.
Exactly. And that's what creates that intense feeling of euphoria.
And dopamine's tied to the brain's reward system, right?
Yes. And that's a big part of why cocaine is so addictive.
So we have these individual neurons talking to each other.
Via synapses and neurotransmitters.
Right. But how do they work together to create those complex behaviors and experiences? That's what I want to know.
Well, that's where neural networks come in.
Neural networks.
Yeah, they're basically interconnected groups of neurons that work together to process information and control behavior.
So it's not just one neuron acting alone.
Nope, it's teamwork.
Is it almost like the internet?
You could say that, with millions, even billions of neurons connected and constantly sharing information.
Like a massive neural network.
Exactly, and just like the internet, neural networks allow our brains to do all sorts of things.
From perceiving the world, to making decisions, to experiencing emotions.
All of that and more.
And we can't forget about those neural codes.
The patterns of activity.
Right. It's not just about whether a neuron is firing, but the specific timing and sequence of those firings.
Exactly. Those neural codes are like the language of the brain, allowing different areas to communicate and coordinate their activities.
So it's all about those patterns.
Patterns are key. It's a dynamic and constantly evolving system that allows our brains to adapt and learn from our experiences.
Which brings us to neuroplasticity.
The brain's ability to change and adapt.
This is one of the most amazing things about the brain.
I agree.
The textbook talks about how the brains of blind people who read Braille rewire themselves.
Oh, yeah.
The area of the brain dedicated to the reading finger actually expands.
That's incredible.
It's like the brain is saying, hey, we're not using this part for vision anymore, so let's repurpose it. It just shows how experience can reshape the brain.
Exactly. Our brains are not fixed.
They're dynamic.
Yes. Constantly evolving throughout our lives.
That's really encouraging because it means we have the potential to learn and grow at any age.
I agree.
But the textbook does say that plasticity has its limits.
Right.
It's much harder for adults to learn new languages than it is for children.
That's true. While our brains remain adaptable, certain types of plasticity decline with age.
So does that mean we should just give up on learning new things as we get older?
No, not at all. While some types of learning might become more challenging, our brains can still learn and adapt. The key is to keep our brains active.
So it's use it or lose it.
Pretty much. The more we challenge ourselves mentally, the better we can maintain that plasticity.
I like that. Now let's zoom out and look at the nervous system as a whole.
Okay.
The textbook describes the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system.
The brain and spinal cord being the control center.
Right, like a command center.
Exactly. It's a vast communication network, with the peripheral nervous system branching out to every part of the body.
It's pretty amazing how it all works together.
It is.
The textbook goes into the structure of the brain, starting with the forebrain.
Where the cerebral cortex is located.
Right, the cerebral cortex. That's like the executive suite of the brain, right?
Exactly. It's responsible for all our higher-level thinking, planning, and decision-making.
And it's divided into 4 lobes,
Frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital.
each with its own specialized functions.
Yes. The textbook does a good job of breaking down each lobe.
The frontal lobes are all about decision-making and planning.
Right.
The parietal lobes process sensory information. The temporal lobes are for memory and language.
Yep.
And the occipital lobes handle vision.
You got it.
And of course, we have to mention Phineas Gage again.
Ah, yes. Poor Phineas.
His accident with the iron rod really showed just how important the frontal lobes are for personality and social behavior,
His case was a turning point in our understanding of the brain.
showing that even small areas of damage can have big consequences.
Exactly. It really highlights how delicate the balance is within the brain.
It makes you appreciate just how complex and resilient this organ is.
For sure. But the cortex isn't the whole story, right?
Right. There are other important structures in the forebrain, like the hypothalamus and the thalamus.
The hypothalamus is like the brain's control center for basic functions like hunger, thirst, and body temperature,
Okay.
while the thalamus acts as a relay station for sensory information.
Routing it to the right parts of the cortex.
Precisely. It's amazing how all these structures work together so seamlessly to keep everything running.
It really is. But what about the midbrain and the hindbrain?
Yes, those are important too.
What do they do?
Well, the midbrain has structures like the superior and inferior colliculi, which are involved in vision and hearing.
So they help us process sensory information.
Exactly. They help us orient ourselves and react quickly to things we see and hear.
Makes sense. And then there's the hindbrain, which has the cerebellum, pons, and medulla.
The cerebellum is like our movement coordinator, making sure our actions are smooth, precise, and well-timed.
I've heard it called the little brain,
That's right. It's also involved in balance and motor learning.
which explains why people with damage to the cerebellum often have trouble with coordination.
Exactly.
And what about the pons and medulla? What do they do?
They control vital functions like breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure.
So they're pretty important.
Essential. They make up the brainstem, the foundation of our existence.
Wow, that's a lot of responsibility.
It is. The brainstem is also involved in sleep-wake cycles.
So even the most basic functions involve lots of different brain areas working together.
Exactly.
But what about the peripheral nervous system?
Yes, the PNS.
It's not just a passive messenger, is it?
No, it plays a vital role in our interactions with the world.
The textbook breaks it down into 2 main branches, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system.
That's right.
So the somatic nervous system is how we control our muscles, right?
Precisely. It's how we interact with the external world.
Okay, so like when I want to move my arm, my brain sends a signal through my spinal cord to the muscles in my arm, making them contract.
Exactly. That's the somatic nervous system in action.
And then the autonomic nervous system is more about the things we don't consciously control.
Like our heart rate, breathing, and digestion.
It's like our body's autopilot.
I like that analogy.
And then the autonomic nervous system is further divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems,
Which work together to keep our body in balance.
So the sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight response,
Exactly. It kicks in when we're stressed or in danger.
increasing our heart rate and blood pressure, getting us ready to either fight or run away.
It's our body's way of dealing with threats.
And the parasympathetic nervous system is the opposite, right? It's about rest and relaxation.
Exactly. It slows things down, lowers our blood pressure, and stimulates digestion.
So it's all about maintaining that balance.
Yes. It's a constant dance between these two systems, adjusting to our internal and external environment.
That's amazing.
It really highlights the complexity and adaptability of our nervous system.
And speaking of adaptation, the textbook takes us on a journey through the development and changes in the nervous system.
From its earliest stages to its remarkable ability to adapt throughout life.
It's like watching the brain evolve.
It is. We talked about those 4 stages of development.
Cell proliferation, migration, circuit formation, and circuit pruning.
Right.
But this development doesn't just stop after childhood, right?
Not at all. The brain continues to change and adapt in response to our experiences
Throughout our lives.
throughout our lives.
That's amazing. So we're constantly learning and growing.
We are. The textbook highlights this plasticity with some great examples.
Like the blind people reading Braille, where the part of the brain for the reading finger gets bigger. It shows just how much experience can shape the brain.
It does.
But the textbook also mentions that plasticity has its limits,
Right.
especially as we age.
It's true. Some types of plasticity do decline with age.
So it's harder to learn new things when you're older.
Well, it might take more effort, but it's definitely not impossible. Our brains can still learn and adapt.
Good to hear.
The key is to stay mentally active and keep challenging yourself.
So use it or lose it.
You got it.
Okay, but what about when things go wrong?
What do you mean?
Like when the brain gets injured or diseased?
Yes, that's when things get really complicated.
The textbook talks about obstacles to recovery from injury in the central nervous system,
Right.
like scar tissue formation, which can prevent those damaged neurons from reconnecting.
That's one of the challenges.
And then there's the blood-brain barrier.
Which is great for protecting the brain.
But it can also make it hard for medications to reach those damaged areas.
That's the downside.
And then the fact that mature neurons don't typically regenerate.
So once they're lost, they're gone.
It's a bit depressing.
It is, but there is some hope.
Oh, like what?
Well, there's a lot of research into things like stem cell therapy.
Using stem cells to replace those damaged neurons.
Exactly.
That's pretty amazing. Are there any other promising approaches?
Yeah, there's also research on rehab therapies that can help the brain rewire itself after injury.
So even though there are challenges, there's still hope for people with brain injuries.
Absolutely.
That's really good to hear.
And the more we learn about the brain, the better we'll be able to develop new treatments.
Okay, I'm ready to move on to something else that's always fascinated me. The nature versus nurture debate.
The age-old question.
Are we more shaped by our genes or by our environment?
Well, the textbook makes it clear that it's not an either situation.
So it's not nature versus nurture.
Right. It's nature and nurture working together.
They both play a role.
They do. Our genes provide the basic blueprint, but our environment and experiences influence how that blueprint is expressed.
So it's like a recipe.
I like that. You might have all of the ingredients, but how you combine them and the environment you cook them in will determine the final outcome.
That makes sense. And it's not just our physical environment, right? It's also our social environment, our experiences, our relationships.
All of those things contribute to who we become,
The textbook talks about twin studies and adoption studies.
which are great for understanding the relative roles of genes and environment.
So twin studies have shown that identical twins are more similar in many traits than fraternal twins.
Which suggests strong genetic influence.
So that doesn't mean the environment is irrelevant.
Not at all. Even identical twins raised in the same environment can have different experiences.
And adoption studies have shown that kids adopted into new families often show similarities to their biological parents.
Even though they were raised in a different environment.
So both genes and environment are clearly important.
They are.
The textbook even mentions epigenetics.
The study of how environmental factors can modify gene expression
Right. So our experiences can actually change our genes.
without changing the underlying DNA sequence.
That's mind-blowing.
It is.
It means that our choices and experiences can have a huge impact, not just on us, but on future generations.
Exactly.
This has been an amazing journey so far.
I agree.
From those tiny neurons to complex neural networks, and now genes and environment.
It's incredible how much we're learning about the brain.
It really is. What a great foundation for understanding the brain and behavior.
It is. And there's still so much more to discover.
I can't wait to dive into more.
Me too. In the next part, we'll explore how the brain shapes our perceptions, emotions, and behaviors.
I'm excited. It's going to be fascinating. Okay, so we've explored a lot about how the brain works. But how does all this translate into our behavior? What makes us do the things we do?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And those first two chapters, they really set the stage for understanding this connection.
One thing that really stuck with me was the concept of neural plasticity, how our brains can change and adapt throughout our lives.
Plasticity is key. It's the foundation of learning and memory.
The textbook gave those cool examples of how musicians' brains actually differ from non-musicians.
Oh yeah, the musician's brains.
They have a larger corpus callosum.
That's the bridge between the two hemispheres.
Exactly. It suggests that musical training leads to physical changes in the brain.
It's like playing an instrument sculpts the brain.
It makes you wonder what other activities could be shaping our brains in ways we don't even realize.
Oh, right.
I know meditation has been shown to affect the brain.
Oh, yeah.
Increases gray matter in areas related to attention and emotional regulation.
Oh, that's
It
fascinating.
really highlights how our experiences mold our brains.
Oh.
But the textbook also mentions that plasticity has its limits, right?
Right, especially as we get older.
So as we age, some of that adaptability fades.
It does. That's why learning new languages, for example, is usually easier for kids than adults.
Makes sense. So does that mean it's all downhill after a certain age?
Not at all. While it might be a bit more challenging, our brains can still learn and grow throughout our lives.
Oh, good. So what's the key to keeping those brains sharp as we get older?
Stay mentally active. Keep those brains engaged.
So it's like, use it or lose it.
Exactly. Mental stimulation is like exercise for the brain. It keeps it healthy and resilient.
So reading, learning new skills, those kinds of things.
Exactly. Even playing brain training games can help.
That's great to hear. I'm definitely going to ramp up my Sudoku game. But now I'm thinking about neurotransmitters.
Ah, yes, those chemical messenger.
What role do they play in shaping our behavior?
They're the communicators between neurons, and they're super important in regulating so many things.
Like our mood and sleep.
All of that, and our ability to learn and remember things.
The textbook mentioned how different neurotransmitters have different effects.
Oh, yeah.
Dopamine is linked to pleasure and reward, while serotonin is all about mood regulation and well-being.
Exactly. And imbalances in these neurotransmitters can contribute to various mental health conditions.
Like depression or schizophrenia.
Right.
It's crazy to think that these tiny molecules can have such a huge impact on our lives.
It's true. It really shows the interconnectedness between the brain and behavior.
And it highlights the importance of understanding neurotransmitters to develop effective treatments for these conditions.
Absolutely. That's where a lot of research is focused right now.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you think our listeners should keep in mind?
I think the main takeaway is that the brain is incredibly complex and dynamic.
Yeah.
From how neurons communicate, to the influence of neurotransmitters, to the power of plasticity.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But it all comes together to create this amazing organ that's responsible for everything we do, think, and feel.
And while our genes give us the blueprint, our experiences and environment play a huge role in shaping how that blueprint unfolds.
Exactly. We're not just products of our biology. We actively shape our own destinies.
I love that idea. It's empowering.
It is. We have the power to influence our brain health and well-being through our choices and experiences.
So we're not passive bystanders.
Nope. We're active participants in our own brain development.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of the brain and behavior. It's been an amazing journey.
It has. Until next time.